You walk into a room holding your 6-month-old. Grandma reaches out for a hug, and your baby, who was smiling 2 seconds ago, suddenly stares at her like she just landed from another planet. No smile, no sound, just this flat, unreadable stare that somehow feels more intense than crying would. And Grandma laughs it off, says, "Oh, she's just shy." And everyone moves on. But here's the thing nobody stops to actually think about. That baby cannot talk, cannot reason, cannot understand the concept of family or strangers or social etiquette. And yet somehow, in a fraction of a second, that baby's brain ran a calculation, compared your face to a stored template, decided Grandma didn't match, and triggered a very specific, very ancient defensive response. That's not shyness. That's software. Extremely old software. And once you understand what's actually happening behind that blank little stare, you start to realize your baby's brain is doing something far more sophisticated than anyone gives it credit for. Let's start with the obvious question nobody actually answers correctly. Why does this even happen? Newborns don't do this. A 2-week-old baby will let literally anyone hold them. Strangers, nurses, the neighbor you've met once. Zero protest. So something changes. And it changes on a schedule that's almost eerily consistent across cultures, across countries, across completely different parenting styles. Somewhere between 6 and 9 months, stranger anxiety switches on. Not gradually. Switches on. Like a light. And developmental psychologists have a name for this. They call it stranger wariness, and it's actually one of the most well-documented milestones in infant development anywhere in the world. Here's why the timing matters so much. Before 6 months, a baby's brain is still building its most basic tool, facial recognition. Newborns can barely tell faces apart at all. They're working with blurry vision, an underdeveloped visual cortex, and a brain that's essentially still installing the operating system. But by around 6 months, something clicks. The baby has now spent months staring at the same 2 or 3 faces for hours a day. Mom, dad, maybe a grandparent. And the brain has done what brains are extremely good at doing. It's built a template, a very specific, very detailed internal map of what your face looks like. Your eyes, your smell, the exact way your mouth moves when you talk. Every new stranger that walks in gets compared against that template in real time. And when the match fails, the brain doesn't shrug it off. It treats mismatch as a signal worth reacting to. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because this isn't some random developmental glitch. This is one of the oldest survival mechanisms your baby's brain has. Think about the environment humans actually evolved in. Not modern apartments with locked doors and background checks. Open camps, shared spaces, unfamiliar people walking through your territory on a semi-regular basis. In that world, a completely undiscriminating baby, one who'd go to literally anyone without hesitation, was a baby with a much higher risk profile. An infant that couldn't distinguish caregiver from stranger couldn't be protected as effectively, couldn't signal danger, couldn't reinforce the bond with the 1 or 2 adults who were actually keeping it alive. So evolution did something clever. It waited until the baby had a strong enough attachment to specific caregivers to actually benefit from a warning system, and then it switched the warning system on. And this connects directly to something called attachment theory, which is one of the most heavily researched ideas in all of developmental psychology. British psychologist John Bowlby proposed decades ago that infants are biologically wired to form a primary attachment bond, usually with a mother or main caregiver, and that this bond isn't emotional fluff. It's a survival mechanism. The baby needs to know, on a level deeper than conscious thought, exactly who is responsible for keeping it alive. And stranger anxiety is the flip side of that same coin. The stronger the attachment to you, the sharper the contrast becomes when someone unfamiliar shows up. In other words, that blank stare Grandma got wasn't a rejection of her. It was proof the bond with you was working exactly as designed. There's also something happening physically in that moment that's easy to miss. Researchers studying infant heart rate during stranger encounters have found measurable changes. Heart rate often spikes slightly. Cortisol, the stress hormone, can rise. The baby isn't performing wariness for an audience. Its actual nervous system is treating the unfamiliar face as a low-grade threat worth monitoring. And this is where the blank stare comes from. It's not indifference. It's the opposite. It's total focused attention, the brain running every scrap of available data through its threat detection system before deciding what to do next. But here's the part that most people never think to ask. Why a stare and not a scream? Why does a 6-month-old freeze and study a stranger's face instead of immediately crying? And the answer is honestly kind of brilliant when you break it down. Staring is information gathering. Crying is a last resort response, expensive in energy, and it draws attention, which in an ancestral environment could be exactly what you don't want if the unfamiliar thing nearby might actually be dangerous. So the brain runs the cheaper option first. Watch, assess, compare against known safe patterns. Mainly, is this person doing anything my trusted caregiver does? Do they hold themselves the same way? Does their voice have a familiar rhythm? Only if the mismatch feels significant enough, or if the stranger gets too close too fast, does the system escalate to full-blown distress. This is also why context changes everything. Put that same wary baby in your arms while the stranger approaches, and the reaction is completely different than if the stranger scoops the baby up without warning. Researchers running what's called the strange situation experiment, a now classic setup in developmental psychology, found this consistently. Babies use their caregiver as what's called a secure base. As long as you're nearby and calm, the baby can tolerate a surprising amount of novelty. Remove that base, or introduce the stranger too abruptly, and the wariness response fires much harder. Your presence isn't just comforting in a vague emotional sense. It's functioning as a literal safety signal that recalibrates how threatening the unfamiliar face actually seems. Now here's something that flips the whole story on its head a little. This wariness isn't permanent, and it's not supposed to be. By around age 2, most children have developed enough cognitive flexibility, enough language, enough understanding of social context, that the rigid stranger versus caregiver system starts to relax. The brain doesn't need blunt pattern matching anymore because it's got better tools now. Curiosity starts to outweigh caution more often, which is exactly why toddlers, unlike infants, will sometimes walk right up to a stranger in a grocery store and start a full conversation, to their parents' mild horror. The system that once triggered a defensive stare has been replaced by something far more nuanced, judgment based on tone, body language, and context rather than a rigid template match. And there's one more layer worth sitting with. Not every baby reacts the same way, and that variation tells us something too. Some infants show intense, stranger anxiety. Others barely blink at new faces. Researchers have found this correlates with temperament, with how much exposure a baby has had to varied faces early on, and with the parenting style around them. Babies who are regularly around a wider circle of trusted, warm adults, grandparents, aunts, family friends, tend to show milder, stranger responses because their internal template of safe faces is simply broader. It's not that they're braver. It's that their pattern library has more entries in it. So the next time your baby freezes up at someone new, that flat, unreadable stare isn't confusion, and it definitely isn't rudeness. It's a 200,000-year-old alarm system doing exactly what it was built to do, comparing an unfamiliar face against the one template that matters most in the entire world to that baby right now. Yours. It's not that your baby doesn't understand what's happening. It's that your baby understands it on a level most adults have completely forgotten how to access. Before language, before reasoning, before any of the tools we normally credit with intelligence, there's this quiet, constant calculation running in the background, asking one single question over and over. Is this person safe? And for a little while at least, only one face in the entire world gets an automatic yes.